Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Kate Pender. I'm the Executive Director and Director of Growth and Development Programs at Fair4All Financ. Welcome to the webinar today. We're going to be sharing with you some insights from our Covid-19 Resilience Fund work. I've got a slight sense of déjà vu at this webinar because the last time I talked about the COVID Fund was when we launched it in April in 2020, and I was sitting in this room at this desk with a slightly smaller plant behind me. So some things have changed and others have not. I think it's just important to reflect at the beginning on what COVID has done and what it's done in particular to the sector. So you'll be hearing today from Damon Gibbons, who has drafted for us the evaluation of the fund, and also from Teresa Manning at Clockwise Credit Union as a case study in terms of the fund that we deployed. We started with the COVID Fund with a recognition that there was going to be a need to really help the sector through COVID. And Kaylee's going to be talking to us about how we used that funding to really ensure that lenders came out of COVID in a position where they were resilient and could continue to help the people that our organisation has been set up to support. And those people in vulnerable circumstances have had, from all of the research that we've seen, the toughest time of all. So we've been really pleased that we've been able to help organisations really try to support those people, and I'm delighted with the findings that Damon's going to share with us today. Obviously, COVID is not yet over. Some interesting announcements yesterday, but we know that the totality of it might seem to have passed in the main, but there is a legacy that we are all living through, and for organisations there are still many challenges ahead. So I'll also cover at the end of our session what we at Fair4All Financ are continuing to do for the sector and more generally for people in vulnerable circumstances. We've got time at the end for Q&A, so please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section. We know from experience that there are lots of them, so we'll try and group those in an orderly fashion at the end of the session. And hopefully cover off all of the things that you want to hear from us about. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Damon to talk about the independent evaluation that he did of the fund and the support that we offered to the 31 organisations who we provided £3.9 million of funding to. Damon, over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm just checking if I'm live. Am I live? Yes, I believe I am. All right, well, it's nice to be here, and thanks very much for that introduction, Kate. I'm going to talk for just about 5 minutes or so about the evaluation that we conducted with regards to the fund, and I'm going to focus on lessons learned and some suggestions for future programmes. Kaylee in a little while is going to deal with many of the facts and figures about how funding was distributed. So I'm not going to dwell on those aspects of things. So firstly, just to explain what we did. Well, the evaluation focused on 3 particular aspects. The first was the design of the fund, the second its implementation, and thirdly its effectiveness. So I'm just going to talk through those here in a little while. We reviewed, as you might expect, all of the written materials, the application forms, monitoring data that was provided to us by Fair4All Financ, which covered all stages of the fund, from its design through to its deployment and obviously its impact. And we also conducted a number of qualitative interviews with key personnel within Fair4All Financ, including Kate herself, who's here, and the PRA, trade associations, ABCOL, Responsible Finance, and 6 of the grant beneficiary organisations, which is a relatively small sample, but it managed to make sure that it was broadly representative, involving both credit unions and CDFIs inside and outside of London, and in terms of the amounts of funding that were provided. So we had quite a range within those 6 beneficiary organisations, which was useful. And some of those organisations also subsequently provided us with additional information in writing. Clear up some points. I think it's just important to note as well that we did have an analytical framework for the evaluation. So we drew on particular the Directory of Social Change's principles of good grant making, and we looked at how Fair4All Financ had designed and implemented this fund against those principles. So it gave us quite a solid base to make an assessment really with regards to the fund's performance. Okay, so just moving on to what we actually found then. Well, firstly, we did find that there was considerable best practice in the design of the fund. We have to understand, thinking back, it seems a long time ago now, but the first national lockdown came in. There was a considerable threat to the community finance sector, both in terms of bad debts, in terms of loss of revenue, and also operational challenges in terms of having to pivot away from branch-based face-to-face provision into more digital or telephone call centre operations, those sorts of things. So there was clear risk at the time of considerable prospect of business failures, to be quite honest with you. And we found certainly that Fair4All Financ acted very swiftly. So it consulted with the major trade associations, with wider stakeholders, including the PRA, and with obviously those lenders that it was actively involved with on previous programmes. It also drew on its previous programmes and its knowledge, things that it had on the blocks, if you like, in terms of future programme and funding activities that were scheduled. And it basically pulled the whole thing together very, very quickly, and much quicker actually than some of the funds which were brought in for the sectors at the time. So I think generally speaking, the design of it was excellent. There was clear strategic direction from the board as well to focus on Fair4All Finance's overarching mission, which is to ensure sustainable lending within the sector as well. And the two objectives were entirely appropriate. As Kate's already said, they were to help the sector come out of the pandemic in a resilient position, but also to enable lending to continue to customers in vulnerable circumstances. So for the end user, there was a considerable risk, of course, that lenders would stop lending, and they would have significant difficulties navigating their way through the pandemic, obviously many of them on furlough or at risk of job loss. So it was pretty essential intervention, and the intervention was sizable and significant. So it was up to £5 million was budgeted. Kaylee will come on to the actual figures in terms of take up against that in a moment, but it was a significant intervention and an important one. So I think moving into implementation, however, there were a couple of areas where perhaps there is some lessons and learning which can be applied moving forwards. Firstly, in terms of the application process, I think we have to recognise it was a difficult situation for Fair4All Financ to find itself in. It wanted to get money out of the door very quickly, and there was an urgent need for it. It needed, however, to ensure that that was targeted correctly to those organisations which definitely needed it, but also to those organisations which were likely to be sustainable at the end of the pandemic or coming out of the pandemic, albeit with its support. So there is a due diligence aspect to all of that, which has to be taken into account. It's not just a question of putting money out the door without any checks and balances on it. And that's a difficult balancing act to strike. I think on reflection, we probably found that it was potentially a slightly over rigorous assessment process. But that's largely because the sector as a whole, not all organisations, but many organisations, perhaps lack the capacity to meet the requirements around due diligence. And that's particularly in respect of financial modelling and also in respect of demographic indicators, which Fair4All Financ were obviously keen to ensure that the fund was targeted towards vulnerable people in vulnerable circumstances. So I think that remains an area which is worth looking at, just to make sure that moving forwards the balance is right between getting the support that the sector needs out, but also looking at how assessment processes and application processes can be streamlined and meet their needs, and also a wider capacity building programme within the sector to bring up, if you like, skills and knowledge around financial modelling, and also perhaps some more standardised approach to demographic collection and things of that nature. I think on another area we found as well, which was significant, was that there was potentially a risk that some hard stop eligibility criteria, and I'm thinking here about the criteria that applicants have a minimum loan book size of £2 million, which was advertised as one of the criteria for the fund. Those sorts of hard stop criteria might not be that useful moving forwards. They can dissuade applicants. So I think that ultimately it's probably better to, and in practice actually that wasn't observed, so there was flexibility and discretion around it. So I think advertising hard stop eligibility criteria isn't really useful. In practice, a much more discretionary approach is actually being taken, and so it'd be better to just advertise that and make that more transparent from the off. I think the last thing as well is that there was a considerable concern, obviously, that some lenders were not going to survive, and that smaller lenders who perhaps weren't on a sustainable footing prior to the pandemic wouldn't be able to get access to the support that was offered. There was some support, however, that was made available to assist with mergers and acquisitions, but that wasn't advertised as part of the fund. So it was identified as a need a bit later on, and Fair4All Financ responded to the needs of people who came forward around that. I think looking forwards, there probably is a case for a defined offer of support around mergers and acquisitions and support for lenders who are not likely to be sustainable moving forwards. I think the other point I would just pick up on is in relation to sustainability, and a clearer definition of what that actually means in consultation with the sector might actually be useful. And finally, we're not out of the woods yet. I think that, the interviews that we had with beneficiary organisations were very clear that the underlying risks have increased. Lending levels are not quite back to pre-pandemic, and although this fund was very important in maintaining lending levels and indeed allowing forbearance to customers in vulnerable circumstances, actually that there is a need for a refresh of support, particularly now that we're also facing a cost of living crisis too. So I'll stop there and I'll hand on to Kaylee.
Thank you, Damon. My name's Kaylee. I'm a portfolio advisor on the Fair4All Financ team. And in this section, we wanted to just share a bit more about the funding, including what organisations received funding, how this money was used, and the overall impact that had on the grantees' business as well as their customers. So as you can see from the map, our Covid-19 Resilience Fund aimed to reach organisations across the whole of England, and we were able to support organisations who had head offices and branches and service points from all over the country. And this map also shows the IMD deciles of the places also. As the applicants on the call will know, we had a very thorough application process, which kind of sought to gather narrative information concerning the social purpose of potential grantees, the challenges that they were being faced with as a result of the pandemic, and also their longer term plans of sustainability post-pandemic. In addition to this, we asked organisations to identify the amount of grant that they required, how much of this was related to financial and technical support, and we asked them to set out what they believe would be likely to happen if they didn't receive a grant. As Damon mentioned, we did have an eligibility criteria that applicants were compared against, but generally the most important eligibility points are the ones that you can see on the screen there, which is having a track record and a continued focus on serving our target customers in vulnerable circumstances with low financial resilience, and also we wanted to see that they had an urgent need for grant funding due to the impact of the pandemic, and a clear plan of what this funding would go towards, and how it would be used. So kind of moving on, of the 53 applicants who applied to the fund, 58% were successful. This meant that we were able to deploy around £3.9 million to 31 organisations. In the year before the pandemic hit, these organisations were lending around £138 million and serving around 136 customers collectively. As you can see, 60% of the organisations who awarded grants had a loan book size of equal to or less than 5 million. The average grant size awarded to credit unions was £122,000, and for CDFIs this was slightly, well, it was higher at 192,000. On the right-hand side, you'll see a general breakdown of the grant allocation and purpose. 29 of the 31 organisations used the grant for financial and technical support. And as Damon mentioned, there was an additional £30,000 that was awarded to 2 organisations for business support and consultancy, and an additional £45,000 awarded to 2 other organisations to help with mergers and acquisitions. Just for a kind of further breakdown of how our COVID grantees spent the funding, as you can see, the most common uses of the grant were bad debt provisioning and replacing lost income, which was reported by 79% and 69% of grantees respectively. This was closely followed by technical support for remote working, which was reported by 55% of the grantees. You can see on the far right that 3 organisations chose the other option for how they spent their grant, and these were maintaining capital ratios, bespoke marketing activities to customers in vulnerable circumstances, and covering branch operating costs. As well as this, several organisations also provided other innovations during this time. For example, Central Liverpool Credit Union took huge steps to help some of their most vulnerable customers, which included delivering money and food parcels straight to their customers' doors. And they also waived their usual fee for faster payments when dispersing around £50,000 of payments, as their members obviously couldn't visit the branch during lockdown. Lewisham Plus Credit Union also created a new COVID support loan with an interest rate of 1% per month as opposed to their usual 3% per month for new members. And West Country Savings and Loans introduced a low interest key worker loan. And this is just a few of kind of the innovations that were reported by our grantee organisations. There are of course a lot more, and that can be seen in the report. Here we just kind of want to delve a bit further into the technical support, which, as I mentioned, was a real important part of our funding. Over half of our grantees received some form of technical support, and the majority of this was spent on remote working and business continuity. As you can see, all of the organisations who received technical support funding agreed or strongly agreed that the grant enabled their team to work more effectively at home and enabled them to better serve their customers during and after lockdown. One organisation said that their staff were able to work more effectively whilst self-isolating, and that being able to work effectively from home is kind of given them a sense that they're transforming as an organisation, and that really gives them a sense of hope and excitement for the future and for them as an organisation. Another organisation also supports this, saying that the grant allowed them to very quickly go almost completely paperless, which they believe is now a permanent improvement for their organisation. We had an organisation say that they could provide more automated options for their customers, and they also noted that they were able to put in a customer care team who were there specifically to support customers struggling with their applications due to digital exclusion, and that this service has remained and become a permanent part of their organisation. So yeah, a lot on the tech side from our grantees. Here we're just going to quickly cover off some of the impact that these grants had. Firstly, we note that grants help to preserve around 50% of lending capacity targeted at people in vulnerable circumstances. In addition to this, you can see from the start of the fund in April 2020 to April 2021, grant recipients' cumulative surpluses were at 1.5 million, and that without the fund, cumulative losses would have been around 2.3 million over the same period. There were several indicators that that showed that lending to customers in vulnerable circumstances recovered swiftly after initial shock, and we have seen that this lending has been sustained across all customers and loan types. There was an increase in the number and value of new loans post-grant, and that trend was consistent amongst most providers. It is important to note there that there are other confounding factors, such as the seasonality of lending to customers in vulnerable circumstances, and the overall increase of customers that would have fallen into vulnerable circumstances because of COVID. So just a few things to take into account with that. Finally, the fund was used to provide considerable forbearance to customers, which again was likely concentrated amongst vulnerable groups. As you can see there, 76% of grant recipients used the fund to make additional provisions for bad debt. Just to kind of focus on lending here, 52% of grantees reported that their lending capacity has either been preserved or increased due to this grant. You know, in addition to this, organisations noted that they felt they were able to almost restart lending post-grant. On the screen, you can see an organisation introduced a 0% loan for NHS workers. And generally, other organisations noted that they felt they could take greater risks when lending, and they felt more confident in lending to new customers, where they would otherwise not have felt that confidence because of obviously the uncertain times. Finally, we're just going to look kind of at the customer impact. There's some really nice quotes there on screen. There's a wealth of evidence that kind of illustrates the financial stress resulting from the pandemic that has been building or has been built amongst families in the lowest income quintile, and in many cases these families have been spending their savings or borrowing to cover everyday costs and essentials, as you can see on screen. That could be travel, food, school uniforms, fuel bills, just to name a few. Community finance providers have played a real key role in mitigating the financial hardships experienced by these people during this period. Responses from our form and qualitative data illustrated that these organisations were able to help some of the most vulnerable customers in the most desperate situations, and acted often as the sole alternative to loan sharks and high-cost lenders. And as mentioned, lending to these customers has been sustained since the grant. We continue to, you know, report on some of our COVID grantees, and we can see that impact. And we can see it here on screen, and we can see the impact that these organisations are having on vulnerable financial on customers, with vulnerable financial circumstances through customer quotes, reviews, and stories. So that's kind of that for this section. I'd like to now hand over to Teresa. Teresa Manning is the CEO of Clockwise Credit Union, and they received a grant from our COVID-19 Resilience Fund. Teresa is going to share her experience of the fund and talk through why Clockwise applied and how they used the grant, and what impact this had on their customers. So Teresa, over to you.
We seem to have lost Teresa, I'm afraid. So whilst we overcome that technical problem, can I suggest that we come back to we do things slightly in the other order. So Temi, perhaps if I talk to the looking ahead and the kind of that side of things, and if we can get Teresa back online, then we can come back to her, if that's all right.
She's back online.
And here she is. Marvellous. Thank you, Teresa.
Okay, Teresa.
Can you... Hi, Teresa. Can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, so sorry about that. I don't know, I seem to have got two versions open somehow, go from one extreme to the other. Okay, right. Thank you very much for that. What I'm going to do is just talk very, very briefly about Clockwise, what the impact of the pandemic was on us, and then talk about the Resilience Fund and how it supported us. So just very quickly, for those of you who don't know, Clockwise is based in Leicester. At the start of the pandemic, we were around just under 15,000 members with a loan book of about 5.4 million. We had a capital asset ratio of 16%. We were in a pretty strong position, to be honest, and we've made surpluses for around 5 years. And then COVID hit, and the first impact, obviously, as with most credit unions, was the lending. We were due to make around £440,000 worth of lending in April 2020, and we made around 220. The average loan, like with so many credit unions, dropped from about 520 to 410. It was a significant drop, and it continued like that. We have had a reduction in the rate of growth in our loan book. It is growing. In that first year ending September, we grew about 12%, but if I'm honest, that was from the first 2 quarters and not the second 2. So there was a small growth, but it wasn't anything near what we had predicted. And of course that impacted on our loan income. Initially we didn't see an awful lot of an impact, but then loans in forbearance, where we weren't generating any income, plus the reduction in the size of the loan book, meant that gradually our profitability was being impacted because we couldn't generate that same level of income. And of course arrears, I mean, that's been mentioned. At one point our loan book had around 500,000 loans in forbearance. It's pretty scary really, because you have no idea how many of those are actually going to come back, how many are going to start paying again, how many are going to go into arrears and eventually turn to write-offs. And we were paying a significantly higher provision for our loans because of the forbearance loans. And of course the situation wouldn't help in Leicester, because in July 2020, when the rest of the country was coming out of lockdown or some restrictions, we went into a further lockdown, which again impacted on our local members' confidence and capacity to apply for loans. So it did hit us quite hard. And of course savings, in common with most credit unions, just went through the roof. So it was this proportionate growth of savings against the lower rate of loan growth, which meant our bank account increased. So our capital asset ratio is dropping and has continued that trend. Not worried yet, it's at 12, but nevertheless it's something that we have to keep monitoring. Covid Resilience Fund. We applied because we wanted to protect members' money. We also applied because we knew that at some point more and more people were going to need access to affordable credit, and we wanted to be in a position to supply that. And we didn't know what the financial impact was going to have on Clockwise. Nobody knew how long it was going to last. Nobody knew what the long-term impact was going to be. So we applied and we received £215,000 worth of grant. 100,000 of that was for financial support, and 115 for technical support, which was wonderful. So how do we use it? Well, the financial support, obviously, as you saw in the graphs before, went towards support covering bad debts, increase in provision, but also we introduced the key worker loan as well, at a lower rate of interest. And we lent out over 600,000 so far, and we're really proud of that. But we felt it was very important to support those particular members in the community. Technical support, obviously working from home, we moved all but 3 of the staff home, so there was a big outlay in equipment, security, moving the phones to the cloud to enable the service provision. But we looked at, why do we normally have people in the branch? What solutions do we need to put in place so that they can access the same services, the same level of service? So we looked at things like better access to e-signatures, Post Office Now to enable people to collect money in the post office so they didn't have to come into the branch, setting up standing orders via open banking, continuous card payments as an alternative to transferring benefits, taking phone apps for people who hadn't got access to Wi-Fi or online services, improving the portal to support people communicating with us, and better online ID so that fewer people needed to provide paper evidence. It's been tremendous. It has really helped us. You know, the aims of the Resilience Fund, as we saw it, was to support people's access to affordable credit. We've done that. Sustain our operations, maintain our circulars and our strength. That's happened. And come out of the crisis, well, we're not quite there yet, but is in a position to thrive. And I would say very much we are in that position. You know, it's made a huge difference to us. We are strong, we're sustainable, we're continuing to provide access to the services to the vulnerable in our society. And just wanted to say thank you very much to Fair4All for that support. Thank you. And now going to pass to Kate.
Thanks so much, Teresa. That was really helpful and really nice to hear directly from one of the organisations that we were able to help. I'm just going to do a little bit of a reflection on the sort of look ahead, and just to start with the impact that we've seen in terms of lending and financial resilience post-COVID. So Kelly, if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So this snapshot is basically taken from the reporting that our investment team get, looking at reporting from 20 grantees in quarters 2 and 3 of 2021, and it excludes the kind of rush of Omicron over Christmas and any kind of the seasonal effects in quarter 4. So if some of this doesn't resonate with you, you'll appreciate why. But essentially the picture that we see from those 20 organisations is loan books slowly recovering. And I think there are some really optimistic figures in there. So the accumulated gross and net loan books look like they've reached their highest level since 2020. They're about £500,000 higher than they were at this point in 2020, and certainly higher than pre-pandemic levels. So seems to be bearing out that the investment that we made has contributed in part to that. Of those 20 organisations, 86% of the new loans that they're issuing are for £1,000 or less. So we use that as a proxy for, are they helping people who need those small loans, which are essential to get by, but might not be as easy to obtain elsewhere. So we think that they're lending well in line with who we're trying to help. But the picture in terms of profitability is inconsistent, and I think it's fair to say that profitability within community development finance institutions is much more challenged than it is within credit unions, albeit that there's obviously huge variations between organisations. So we're not kind of publishing an average value there because it would be quite nonsensical. I think the reflection that Holly, who's our Director of Investment and who's unable to be here today because ironically she actually has COVID, her reflections on this are really insightful. And one of the points that she was reflecting on is that the availability of emergency funding in 2020, including our funds, really did help these organisations come through. But there was much less available in 2021, even though COVID was continuing to have really significant effects, and we all saw that occur. So the while the loan book position seems to be on a good trajectory, there's lots of challenges with arrears, with provisioning, and you've just heard from Teresa on that too. There's a bit of a crystal ball gazing game going on to really understand how that is going to play out over the longer term. And their arrears position, lots of the organisations that we support are really reporting quite high rates of arrears, and it's probably too early to tell exactly how those will unwind in total. So some mixed kind of outcomes, but certainly overall I think the organisations that we look at are in a better place than we might have hoped had this fund not been available. So just to move on to our reflections on the recommendations, and I thought Damon captured really well the blend of kind of challenges that we had between pace and probity, if you like. The challenge for us was the priority to move as quickly as we could, and I think one of the things that that enabled us to move really quickly was that we had existing approaches to due diligence from our scale-up fund, which meant that when our board agreed to put £5 million aside for this fund, we could repurpose a lot of that approach towards the COVID fund and to do it really quickly. That meant that we launched the fund on the 9th of April and we paid out the first batch of grant funds by the 30th of April, well ahead of central government launching any kind of equivalent fund. So we were really pleased with that. But as the reports highlighted, the kind of trade-off for that pace was that there was perhaps too much rigidity in the process, and the use of the hard stop eligibility criteria didn't help convey to everyone that we were trying to be much more flexible than the words actually said. So that's a real lesson learned for us. There are two other things that we're really considering. One is about how else we might help on merger and acquisition activity, because we know that that's important and it can be quite challenging for organisations to fund the necessary activities to make M&A work successfully. And the last point is really just to say, through our work in this COVID fund, we have engaged a lot with credit unions over what good practice looks like, and we have started drafting a guide just to reflect on some of that learning, which we're hoping to publish later this year. So just talking a little bit further about what else is to come this year and looking ahead, just to touch on a few of those things. So as you'll all be aware, our Affordable Credit Scale-Up programme continues. We've now made an investment of over £22 million in 11 community finance providers. Throughout that work, it's been really clear that the sector needs a really multifaceted solution. It's not just capital, it's also capability and enhancements and technology and everything else. So one of the things that we're launching later this month is our approach to transforming technology through the Technology Investment Fund. I'm sure those of you who love webinars will be signing up for the upcoming webinar on that towards the end of the month. We've also got quite a lot of work underway piloting innovative solutions for affordable credit. So on the 14th of this month, the applications closed for our no interest loan scheme pilot. And in connection with that, we also had a particular part of that procurement, which was about appointing providers to pilot other affordable credit solutions with us, and we've got some really exciting responses. That's all I can say on that, as you'll appreciate the nature of procurement. But suffice to say, we've got a team beavering away looking at those responses right now. We're also really pleased to be commencing some important work on customer insight and branding. We know that for lots of organisations in this sector, there's a real challenge around constrained marketing budgets. So this work is about helping lenders really hone their customer persona, customer segmentation work, and figuring out how best to reach the audiences that they're targeting. And really in response to some of the analytics that we've seen about the very palpable collapse of the provision of credit with some major exits from the market, we've started to commission work into illegal money lending, because we're very conscious that although the supply of credit seems to have dried up quite considerably, the demand for it very probably has not. And so we're looking at whether any of that alternative provision has actually been mocked up by illegal lenders. It's a pretty vexed topic, but an important piece of research. We haven't been content to just rest with the funding that we have, so we're also calling for more long-term funding to support the entire community finance sector, and we've been doing that through things like the consultation on the Dormant Assets Bill and others. So quite a lot sort of in play for us. I hope that gives you a reasonably kind of rounded view of what we've got on and the learnings that we've taken from the fund thus far. I just want to thank the presenters today, in particular Teresa and Damon and Kaylee, and I'd like to just open it up for questions. I think we've got a few questions in the chat, but if you'd like to put any more in, we're certainly happy to take those from now. So there's a question from Alan Hignett at Hay Credit Union. Damon, I wonder if you'd like to come to that one.
Yeah, just waiting to go live, I think, if that's possible.
It's in the published list, so essentially.
Yeah. I can see it now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes. Okay. So I'm not so sure that I'm suggesting a change in direction. I think the report certainly says there's a need for a refresh of support needs. So, you know, what was true at the start of the pandemic is no longer true. Some of the pressures are still the same, but ultimately we're now facing a cost of living crisis, which brings in new pressures to the sector. And I think the question's got it about right. You know, there is a paradox between trying to expand provision to people in vulnerable circumstances at the same time that those people are facing even more straitened circumstances and may fail affordability assessments, as well as pose a greater risk to bad debt too. So there is a challenge there. There's no question about that. In terms of how to respond to that, I mean, the questioner has put in a specific proposal. I'm not going to say yes or no to that. I think the important thing to do is that Fair4All remains in consultation with the sector about the support needs and pressures that are being faced, and makes a response accordingly to that. So I'm sure that's something, Kate, that you will be doing, and you're obviously pressing for more money anyway, to look at how you can support the sector moving forward. But yeah, I think that the challenge is correct, and we do need to find some way of responding to it, but that's going to take Fair4All Finance and the sector in consultation, I would have thought.
Thanks, Damon. Those are really, really helpful points. I think the only other reflection I'd make on that, Ellen, and it's a good question, is that, for example, with the no interest loan scheme, we have the advantage of a bad debt guarantee, and some of those mechanisms are I think, particularly relevant for specific use cases. There's an ongoing challenge for us about using our funds in a way that makes sure that we preserve the capital so that it can be recycled and continue to grow the sector. So there's always a sensitivity for us about how much of our funds go towards bad debt itself. But that guarantee supported by Treasury, for example, on nils, was a really great way to enable us to do nils in a much more significant way than usual. I think you've also posted a question, Ellen, about the retention of our due diligence versus what was put in place elsewhere in other sectors. And I think I just reflect there that for us, the COVID Resilience Fund was quite a big pivot from what we were set up to do, because our raison d'etre was very much about scaling the sector rather than preserving capital. And COVID really forced us to rethink that we needed that focus on retaining the existing lending capacity, not just being able to grow it. But with that came quite a lot of emphasis on making sure, to the points that Damon put in the report, that we were going to back organisations who would still be there to lend at the end of the pandemic. And that meant that we were very keen on sustainability of those organisations overall, and for that reason retained a lot of that due diligence emphasis. As I said at the beginning, on reflection, we probably could have toned that back slightly, but by virtue of recycling what we had, it meant that we could both assess applications and pay out funds within 15 working days of starting the fund, which is that, you know, tension, isn't it, between pace and customising something perfectly for the circumstances. So in this case, perhaps we went too tightly towards pace, but it certainly got us there. So there's another question about, would it have been better if we used expertise from the sector rather than external consultants? We really didn't use external consultants for the bulk of the assessments that we did. We had some external help from an accounting firm looking at financial due diligence, but we had our own team who had already been working across the sector on the scale-up applications, looking at COVID and the applications that we got from organisations overall. So I think our approach to that was a pretty reasonable fit of augmenting really specialist expertise on the financial side, but retaining as much as possible an emphasis on people who did already know about the sector and how the organisations within it operated. Okay, I'm not sure if there are any more questions coming. I suspect some of you might be keen to run off and grab some lunch, which is entirely fair enough. If you do have any more questions, please feel free to email us. We'll also share these slides after the session. And in closing, I just want to pay tribute to my colleague Holly, who hasn't been able to be with us today, but who's been really instrumental in taking our support through this fund forward, and in making sure that we worked really closely with the organisations that benefited, and that all of the reporting and insight that we've been able to share with you today was possible. So big thanks to Holly. Also just like to thank Damon and Teresa and Kaylee again for joining us and sharing their reflections, and to all of you for being here. We were really pleased that we were able to help in this way, and also to share the learning that we have acquired in doing it. So thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you in due course.